Madagascar broke away from Africa about 165 million years ago, and it has been drifting alone in the Indian Ocean ever since, which means that almost every living thing on it evolved in complete isolation from the rest of the planet. It is the fourth largest island on Earth, and it is larger than France, and yet roughly 90% of the species you find there exist nowhere else in the world at all. The 30 million people who live on it speak a language whose closest known relatives are spoken 7,500 kilometers away on the island of Borneo. Nothing about this place adds up, and once you understand why it does not add up, you will never look at a world map in quite the same way again. These are 40 geography facts about Madagascar that sound completely made up, and every single one of them is real. Start with the break, because everything else follows from it. Around 180 million years ago, the supercontinent Gondwana began tearing itself apart, and Madagascar was locked in the middle of the wreckage between the crust that would become Africa and the crust that would become India. The African side split away first and opened the Mozambique Channel, which is now about 400 kilometers across at its narrowest point. And that does not sound like a serious barrier until you understand that it has never closed again in 165 million years of continuous drift. Then around 88 million years ago, India tore loose from Madagascar and ran north at a speed that geologists still describe as absurd for a continent before it slammed into Asia and pushed up the Himalayas. Madagascar simply stayed where it was, and it has been sitting in the same stretch of ocean since before the last dinosaurs died, which is the single fact that explains almost everything strange about it today. Isolation on that timescale does something to life that is genuinely difficult to imagine from the outside. When Madagascar separated the animals on board were whatever happened to be standing there at the moment, the connection broke, and after that almost nothing new could reach the island by any route at all. 400 kilometers of open ocean looks like nothing on a map, but for a land animal that cannot swim or fly, it is effectively an infinite distance. So the island became a closed biological experiment that ran without interruption for longer than flowering plants have dominated most continents, and the results are visible in every forest on it. Around 90% of its wildlife is endemic, which is the technical way of saying that it lives there and absolutely nowhere else on Earth. That figure is not a generous rounding of something like 60%. And for several major groups, the real number runs even higher than 90. The scale of that becomes clearer when you put it against the size of the island itself. Madagascar covers roughly 0.4% of the land surface of the planet, and yet it holds somewhere close to 5% of all the species known to science, which makes it one of the most concentrated pockets of life anywhere in the world. Nearly every land mammal on the island is unique to it, and so is almost every one of its reptiles, and around 80% of its plants grow naturally nowhere else. About half of all the chameleon species on Earth live on this one island, and that includes a genus of leaf chameleons so small that one recently described species measures around 13 millimeters from nose to tail, which makes it a serious contender for the smallest reptile ever found. Biologists sometimes call Madagascar the eighth continent, and they are not being poetic about it because, in ecological terms, that is very close to what it actually is. The most famous product of that isolation is the lemurs, and the story behind them is far stranger than most people realize. Lemurs are primates in the same way that we are primates, but they are not monkeys and they are not apes. And their branch split from the rest of the primate family long before either of those groups existed anywhere on the planet. Every one of the roughly 100 lemur species alive today lives only on Madagascar and on a handful of tiny neighboring islands, and there is no wild population anywhere else in the world. Their ancestors almost certainly arrived by accident on floating rafts of vegetation that were washed out of African river mouths and carried across the channel by ocean currents that ran the right direction tens of millions of years ago. Once they landed, they found an island with almost no competition and almost no predators waiting for them. and they expanded into every ecological role that monkeys and squirrels and even woodpeckers occupy on other continents. The eye shows how far that process went, and it is probably the strangest primate on the planet. It has enormous ears and a permanently growing front tooth, and one skeletal middle finger that is far longer and thinner than the others. And it uses that finger to tap on dead wood and listen for the hollow sound of a grub tunnel underneath. Then it gnaws a hole and hooks the grub out with the same finger, which is exactly the job that woodpeckers do everywhere else in the world. Madagascar has no woodpeckers, so a primate evolved into one instead. That is the whole island in a single animal because evolution here did not repeat what it did elsewhere, and instead it started over from a different set of ingredients and arrived at a different answer to the same problem. Now, the fact that genuinely stops people. The Malagasy language spoken across an island lying off the coast of Africa is not an African language at all, and it never was. It belongs to the Austronesian family, which stretches from Taiwan through the Philippines and Indonesia out into the Pacific. And its closest known relative is Manyan, which is spoken today in southern Borneo, about 7,500 kilometers away across the entire width of the Indian Ocean. That is not a trading contact, and it is not a linguistic coincidence because the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence and the linguistic evidence all point to exactly the same conclusion. The first permanent settlers of Madagascar sailed there from what is now Indonesia somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 years ago, and they crossed the widest stretch of open ocean any people had crossed at that point in human history to reach an island that had never seen a human being. That crossing left fingerprints all over the island that are still visible today. The staple crop of the Malagasy highlands is rice, and it is grown in terraced paddies cut into the hillsides in a way that looks far more like Java or Bali than like anywhere in mainland Africa. The outrigger canoe design used along parts of the coast has direct parallels in Southeast Asia, and so do several musical instruments and burial customs and elements of the traditional house layout. Later waves of settlement did bring Bantu-speaking people across from the African mainland, along with Zebu cattle, which remain the central measure of wealth in much of the country. But the language that won, and the language that 30 million people speak today, came from the far side of an ocean. Madagascar was one of the last major landmasses on the planet to be settled by humans, and it was reached from Asia before it was ever reached from Africa, which had been sitting 40 hours of sailing away the entire time. The plants are every bit as strange as the animals, and the baobabs make that case better than anything else on the island. Baobabs are the trees that look as though somebody planted them upside down and left the roots waving around in the air, and most of the world's baobab species grow naturally only on Madagascar. The entire African mainland has exactly one species, and Australia has one, and all the rest of them are Malagasy. Individual trees are estimated to live well past 1,000 years, and their swollen trunks can hold tens of thousands of liters of water, which is precisely how they survive months at a time without any rain at all. The famous Avenue of the Baobabs near Morondava is not an avenue that anybody planted, and that is the part most visitors never learn. It is simply what was left standing after the forest around it was cleared for farmland, because those particular trees were too useful to cut and too difficult to remove. Then there is a place on the west of the island that barely looks like it belongs on this planet at all. The Tsingy de Bemaraha is a forest of limestone spikes, covering hundreds of square kilometers where rain has dissolved the rock into blades and needles so sharp that crossing them without ropes and boards is genuinely impossible. The name comes from a Malagasy phrase that translates roughly as the place where one cannot walk barefoot, which is about as direct as a place name ever gets. It formed because a thick bed of ancient limestone was lifted up out of the sea and then attacked from above by tropical rainfall, and from below by moving groundwater, until what remained was a labyrinth of vertical stone, with canyons and caves threaded underneath it. Whole animal populations lived down inside those canyons that biologists could not properly study, until walkways and suspension bridges were built through the massif in recent decades. and some of those species have never been recorded anywhere else on the island. Madagascar is often called the Great Red Island, and that name comes from something you can see from orbit. Much of the interior sits on ancient lateritic soil stained deep red by iron oxide, and when the forest cover that held that soil in place is stripped away, the tropical rain carries it straight down into the rivers and out to sea. Satellite photographs of the Betsiboka estuary on the northwest coast show the water running rust red for kilometers offshore, and astronauts on the space station have described the view as the island appearing to bleed into the ocean. This is not a small or local problem because Madagascar has lost a very large share of its original forest cover, and the erosion that follows every clearance takes the topsoil with it. That is the same topsoil that farming depends on, which means the island holding 5% of the world's species is also one of the poorest countries on Earth, and those two facts are wired tightly together. The isolation also produced giants and then lost them, and the timing of that loss is far more recent than almost anyone expects. Until roughly 1,000 years ago, Madagascar was home to the elephant bird, which was the heaviest bird that has ever existed anywhere on the planet. It stood around 3 meters tall and weighed as much as half a ton, and it laid eggs with the volume of about 160 chicken eggs, which makes them the largest eggs produced by any animal known to science. Fragments of those shells still wash up on beaches along the southern coast where people occasionally reassemble them. The island also carried gorilla-sized lemurs and a dwarf hippopotamus and a giant tortoise, and every one of those animals disappeared within a few centuries of humans arriving. The largest carnivore left on the island today is the fossa, and it weighs about 12 kilograms, which means Madagascar did not lose its giants in some distant prehistoric era, but around the time cathedrals were going up across Europe. The modern economy of the island rests on a plant that is not even native to it, which is the sort of contradiction Madagascar specializes in. The country produces roughly 3/4 of the world's vanilla, and almost every vanilla-flavored product on the planet passes at some stage through the hands of Malagasy farmers. Vanilla comes from an orchid that originated in Mexico, where it is pollinated by a specific bee, and that bee does not exist anywhere on Madagascar. So every single flower has to be pollinated by hand inside a window of a few hours on the one day of the year that it opens. A 12-year-old boy on the neighboring island of Réunion worked out the technique for doing that in 1841, and the entire global vanilla supply still depends on the method he invented. Prices swing violently because one cyclone can erase a harvest, and at times vanilla has traded higher per kilogram than silver. Cyclones are the other force that shapes daily life there, and Madagascar sits squarely in their path every year. The southwest Indian Ocean generates a steady stream of tropical cyclones, and the island absorbs several of them in a normal season, which makes it one of the most cyclone-exposed countries anywhere in the world. The eastern coast takes the worst of it because it faces thousands of kilometers of open ocean, with essentially no shelter, and the narrow band of rainforest along that side is soaked by moisture carried in on the trade winds year after year. Cross the mountains to the western side, and the landscape turns into dried deciduous forest, and keep going to the far south, and you reach spiny desert, where the plants look like equipment from another planet. One island holds rainforest and desert and high plateau within a few hundred kilometers of each other, because the mountain spine running down the center blocks the weather from ever getting across. So why does any of this exist? The answer is that Madagascar is a fragment of a continent rather than a volcanic island, and that single distinction changes absolutely everything about it. Volcanic islands like Hawaii rise out of the seafloor completely empty, and then get colonized slowly over millions of years by whatever manages to fly or float or drift to them. Madagascar broke off already carrying a full cargo of Gondwanan life, and then took that cargo into solitary confinement for 165 million years, without a single interruption. The mountains down the center reach almost 2,900 meters, and they slice the island into completely separate climates. The channel is narrow enough that a few lucky rafts made the crossing over geological time, and wide enough that almost nothing else ever did. Every strange thing on Madagascar traces back to one piece of crust that stopped moving while everything around it kept going. What makes this island remarkable is not any single one of these facts on its own. It is that all of them are stacked on top of each other in the same place. A continental fragment that has been isolated since the age of dinosaurs and a population that sailed there from Southeast Asia rather than from the coast 40 hours away. 100 species of primate that exist nowhere else, and a primate that evolved into a woodpecker. Trees that store water like tanks and rock formations that cannot be walked across, and a bird that outweighed a grown adult. And all of it balanced on red soil that is washing into the sea fast enough to photograph from orbit. Madagascar is the clearest demonstration anywhere on the planet of what happens when a piece of the world is left completely alone for long enough, and it is also the clearest demonstration of how fast that can be undone. Which one of those actually surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments below because I genuinely read every single one of them. And if you want more places that make no sense at all, there are plenty more of them waiting for you on this channel.